Hi again. Please like the video and comment down below where you're listening from and what time is currently. Let's get to it. The morning air over southern New Mexico was already hot when a passing driver spotted movement on the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be an injured animal, but as he slowed, he saw a woman, barefoot and half naked, a metal chain dragging at her wrist as she stumbled through the dust. Her face was caked with blood and dry tears, her breath ragged. She waved frantically, choking on the words, "Help me, please." That woman was 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil. In a few seconds, she crossed from private nightmare to public evidence of one of the most horrifying crimes ever uncovered in the American Southwest. The motorist brought her to safety at a nearby mobile home, where neighbors locked the door and dialed the police. Officers arrived to find her trembling, chained, and terrified. Between gasps, she pointed back toward Elephant Butte Lake. "He's got other women," she said. "He's going to kill them." Her voice shook as she tried to explain who he was. A man calling himself David. She said there was a woman helping him named Cindy. The officers wrote the information down, not yet understanding the scale of what they were about to uncover. When investigators traced Vigil's description to a property near Elephant Butte, they expected to find a kidnapper's den. What they found was closer to an engineered nightmare. Inside a double-length trailer parked behind Ray's modest home sat what he called his toy box. It was built with surgical precision, walls lined in stainless steel, ceiling hooks fitted with pulleys, a padded operating table bolted to the floor. Nearby, police found cameras, ropes, medical instruments, clamps, and a large collection of tapes and written notes. Everything inside pointed to a system, an organized design for prolonged captivity. The soundproofing was so complete that neighbors never heard a sound. Even with the door closed, voices inside disappeared into silence. Investigators said the air in the trailer felt stale, like a place cut off from the world. On one counter, they found a cassette ready to play. Out of morbid duty, one of the technicians pressed play. A man's voice came through the speakers, calm, flat, rehearsed, welcoming a new prisoner and explaining what would happen to her. That voice belonged to David Parker Ray. It was a meticulously recorded monologue, designed to destroy hope before torment even began. He called it his introduction. In it, he described in graphic detail the rules of captivity and the punishments for resistance. He told victims that everything was determined, that escape was impossible. For investigators standing inside the small trailer, the implications were overwhelming. How long had this chamber been used? How many victims entered and never left? Within hours, the small police department of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, realized the magnitude of the case exceeded their capacity. They called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation and State Police. The scene was secured, photographs taken, and evidence catalogued. Behind the locked door of that trailer, officers found whips, gags, syringes, and carefully labeled diagrams showing restraint positions. There were mirrors mounted at angles suggesting voyeuristic intent. Every tool had a purpose. Every surface was scrubbed clean. The press would later call Ray the toy box killer, borrowing from the name he had given his own trailer. But in that moment, labels meant little. The first responders who entered the chamber described feeling disoriented. One compared it to stepping into a surgical lab designed for pain. Experienced officers turned pale and stepped away. Some vomited after leaving the scene. None of them could reconcile the contrast between the horror inside and the quiet desert community around them. In a later interview, one investigator said, "It was not chaos, it was precision. Every inch of that space told you he planned this for years." They collected hundreds of items. Many were custom-made, suggesting engineering skills and long-term preparation. Among the files recovered were diaries, hinting at dozens of victims stretching back years, most never identified. In police custody, Cynthia Vigil slowly began to fill the gaps. Her account was fragmented by trauma, but consistent enough to map what she survived. She said Ray had kidnapped her under the pretense of hiring her for work. Instead, she was drugged, chained, and taken to the trailer. There, she woke to the recorded welcome message. She remembered hearing the man's voice explaining that she was now property and must obey. For 3 days, she endured physical and psychological abuse before a mistake set her free. The immediate stakes were clear. If Vigil told the truth, there could be more women trapped or already buried in the desert. Time mattered. Officers worked around the clock to process the property, search nearby terrain, and interrogate anyone connected to Ray. The discovery also exposed deep social fault lines. Many of Ray's suspected victims were sex workers, runaways, or women with addiction histories, groups often dismissed when they disappeared. That neglect now looked like the perfect camouflage for a serial predator. Reporters descended on Truth or Consequences within days. Locals watched their quiet retirement town transform into the center of national attention. Residents who remembered Ray as a polite mechanic struggled to believe it was the same man leading nightly newscasts. But as new evidence surfaced, photographs, names, and phone call logs, the narrative hardened. This was not a single crime. It was a long-running operation, hidden in plain sight. Authorities tried to retrace Ray's steps. They found that he kept meticulous notes about his machinery but vague entries about people, almost as if their lives were inventory rather than individuals. The timeline hinted that he had been active since at least the early 1990s. Some investigators suspected much earlier. For the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the complexity of the case required a multi-agency task force. Specialists in profiling and forensics joined the effort. A preliminary psychological assessment described a personality obsessed with control, deriving pleasure from domination more than from killing itself. He treated his crimes like experiments, methodical and repeatable. Meanwhile, the broader public faced the deeply unsettling question: how had he operated for so long without detection? Truth or Consequences had barely 5,000 residents. People knew each other by name. Yet behind one man's locked trailer was a secret that made even seasoned detectives hesitate to enter. The investigation's first phase unfolded rapidly, but understanding its depth would take years. Cynthia Vigil's escape marked only the beginning. The evidence inside the toy box forced law enforcement to piece together a history that stretched back decades. Each artifact hinted at unseen victims and unsolved disappearances across New Mexico, Arizona, and possibly Texas. By week's end, the case file filled with statements, photographs, and psychological evaluations. The story drew national horror because it touched on primal fears: being trapped, silenced, erased. But for investigators, the most haunting realization came not from what they found, but from what they could not. There were tools that suggested the use of recording equipment, yet most tapes were missing. There were personal items clearly belonging to others, with no identities to match them. As night fell over Elephant Butte Lake, the trailer sat sealed behind blue tape. Flashing lights reflected off the metal siding. Officers spoke quietly, some shaking their heads. Inside, evidence markers glowed under harsh lighting, each note marking the intersection of suffering and secrecy. To understand who could have built such a place, and why, it was necessary to go back to Belen, New Mexico. Decades earlier, where a boy named David Parker Ray began developing the compulsions that would one day lead to the toy box. To explain the discovery, we have to learn how that boy became a man capable of designing horror by hand. David Parker Ray grew up far from the desert lakes where his crimes would later unfold. He was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, a modest railway town southwest of Albuquerque. The streets were quiet, and families knew each other by sight, but behind closed doors, his early life was marked by instability. His father, Cecil Ray, was a strict, often violent man who drank heavily and disciplined his children with cruelty that blurred into abuse. His mother worked long hours and was rarely home. Neighbors later described the Ray family as withdrawn and stern, the kind of household where children were kept quiet, not comforted. When David was 10, his parents separated. His father disappeared from his daily life, but continued to visit occasionally, bringing not gifts, but pornographic magazines and explicit photographs. Those images became part of David's foundation, a disturbing early window into abuse tied to domination. Teachers noticed the boy was quiet, intensely polite, but easily humiliated. He rarely socialized and showed signs of anxiety when confronted or teased. At home, he had room to experiment. According to later psychological evaluations, Ray began showing cruelty toward animals in early adolescence. Neighbors recalled finding injured dogs and cats near his home, though no one ever proved it was him. One former classmate remembered hearing David boast about tying animals down and testing them. When questioned, he would laugh nervously and change the subject. In the 1950s, such behavior rarely triggered intervention. It was brushed off as boys being boys, but seen through a forensic lens decades later, it was an early signal, patterns of domination repeating themselves on powerless victims. His teenage years were filled with isolation. He spent hours tinkering with engines and tools in the garage. Mechanical precision fascinated him. Machines obeyed where people resisted. Friends, few as they were, said he preferred working alone. Around this time, his interest in pornography grew more extreme. He drew crude sketches of bondage scenes, collecting and modifying them with mechanical notes in the margins, gears, pulleys, clamps. To outsiders, it looked like engineering practice. In hindsight, it was something darker, the beginning of design thinking applied to control. Ray's teachers described him as intelligent but disengaged. He graduated without distinction and enlisted in the United States Army shortly after turning 18. The military gave him structure and a trade, mechanical maintenance. He learned how to operate precise systems, calibrate instruments, and manage complex machinery. Those technical skills would later become crucial to his crimes. The army also gave him his first exposure to authority that demanded absolute obedience, reinforcing a worldview already shaped by dominance and submission. While stationed in various locations, he had brief relationships with women. Several reported that he was controlling and emotionally cold. He expected compliance in every detail and reacted unpredictably to defiance. Nothing overtly criminal was documented at that stage, but the pattern was clear. Affection was replaced by order. By the time he returned to New Mexico in the mid-1960s, he had several failed marriages behind him and a growing inability to connect emotionally with others. Ray took work as a mechanic, both for local employers and the State Park Service. Colleagues described him as skilled, punctual, and quietly distant. He was the man who could fix anything mechanical but rarely joined conversations. Beneath that professionalism, he maintained an elaborate private life, developing fantasies that revolved around kidnapping and abuse. Around this period, he began keeping diaries. Early entries were technical, but they gradually evolved into monologues exploring imagined acts of torture. He did not write in the tone of a sadist, reveling in chaos. He wrote like an engineer, documenting procedure. Investigators later said those diaries read more like user manuals than confessions, detached, systematic, focused on efficiency and control. Mental health experts who reviewed them described an obsessive-compulsive pattern aimed at perfection of method. He viewed human suffering as a mechanism to be refined. His lack of empathy was not impulsive. It was measured. Ray's connection to his father remained complicated. There were sporadic reunions, but the elder Ray's influence left lasting marks. Exposure to dominance framed as masculinity shaped David's concept of intimacy. Violence and power became entwined. As adulthood progressed, Ray's relationships followed predictable arcs: charm, control, escalation, withdrawal. When partners expressed fear or tried to leave, he turned detached, dismissing their reactions as weakness. Some later mentioned he kept tools that did not seem relevant to regular mechanic work: restraints, chains, surgical clamps. None suspected his intentions. Assuming they related to his tinkering hobby, he also began constructing small private spaces, sheds, workstations, trailers, where he could modify equipment. He would build handmade devices intended to immobilize or bind. Co-workers occasionally helped him weld or machine parts without asking their purpose. To them, he was simply the quiet craftsman who liked building things. No one questioned what those things were for. Psychologists later suggested that during this period, Ray's fantasy life overtook his external one. Instead of venting or diminishing over time, his dark imagination became his main outlet. He sought materials, books, stored images, sometimes hand-drawn manuals that mirrored his interests. For years, he practiced secrecy as a lifestyle, keeping one face for the town and another locked away. This duplicity became so habitual that deceit no longer registered as deception. It was simply maintenance of the world he needed to function. Records show that by the late 1970s, Ray owned a series of small properties around the Elephant Butte area. Each had private workshops. Those locations would later be key to reconstructing his path toward the toy box. Yet at the time, no one connected the dots. Local law enforcement only knew him as a reliable state employee, involved in minor infractions, but nothing serious. The line between hobby and pathology remained unseen because Ray lived methodically within the bounds of normal life. When decades later, investigators traced his story backward, they struggled to locate a single dramatic trigger. His descent was not sudden. It grew like corrosion, slow, internal, masked by competence. From neglected childhood to disciplined soldier to respectable worker, each stage added another layer of concealment. By his mid-50s, David Parker Ray had perfected anonymity. He lived alone near the lake, surrounded by tools and gadgets, trusted enough to have keys to several maintenance facilities. Neighbors thought he was harmless, maybe a bit eccentric. They could not see the meticulous records he kept at home or the fantasies expanding from notebook sketches into tangible plans. The man who would one day terrify investigators had been forming that identity for decades. His upbringing taught obedience through pain. The army taught him precision. Solitude taught him secrecy. Those elements fused into a psychology where people were mere mechanisms to be manipulated. By the time Cynthia Vigil stumbled from his trailer in 1999, the evolution of David Parker Ray was complete. A quiet boy from Belen, grown into a man whose cruelty was engineered over a lifetime. To the outside world, David Parker Ray looked ordinary. In the early 1990s, he lived in a trailer near Elephant Butte Lake, where retirees, fishermen, and tourists shared space with locals who relied on the recreation economy. Ray worked for the State Park Service, maintaining boats, engines, and utility systems. Colleagues described him as dependable, quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself but never caused trouble. When something mechanical broke, people turned to him. That reliability built trust, the kind that would later hide something far darker. He was not the kind of neighbor who drew attention. He waved in passing, helped fix small problems, and spent evenings tinkering alone. Friends said he liked old cars, country music, and solitude. Nothing about him suggested violence. Yet, behind the small talk, he was building a hidden domain, a place where his private fantasies could exist without interruption. The trailer he kept behind his house looked like any other work shed from the outside. Over time, he reinforced its walls, added insulation, and installed multiple locks. He bought surgical equipment through mail-order catalogs and collected materials from junkyards and surplus sales. Piece by piece, he transformed the space into a soundproof prison. The process took years. Each modification represented the merging of his technical ability with his desire for control. Meanwhile, his social circle narrowed to those who could serve his purpose. His daughter, Jessie Ray, had grown up in the shadow of his dual personality. She had seen glimpses of equipment and unsettling behavior, but did not fully grasp the extent of his interests. As she reached adulthood, her relationship with him blurred the line between loyalty and fear. Investigators later learned that Jessie introduced acquaintances to him, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what those meetings sometimes became. Then came Cindy Hendy. She entered Ray's life after moving from Washington State to escape her own criminal troubles. Rough-edged and outspoken, she became both his companion and accomplice. Within months, she knew about the trailer. He presented it not as a threat, but as a secret world where his needs could be met safely. Hendy later claimed that she accepted it because it offered her power she had never had. Together, they became a closed system. He supplied the method. She provided the access. To outsiders in Truth or Consequences, they were an odd but unremarkable couple. They shopped for groceries, attended local events, and even invited acquaintances over for drinks. No one saw anything amiss. What visitors could not know was that just yards away, inside a fortified trailer, Ray's private fantasies were becoming physical reality. Throughout the early 1990s, disappearances trickled across the region. Women involved in sex work, hitchhikers, and those struggling with addiction. Many were last seen in Albuquerque, Socorro, or near Elephant Butte. Most were not reported missing immediately, and those who were seldom generated sustained investigations. Police viewed these cases as transient disappearances, not homicides. That blind spot became Ray's security blanket. He studied patterns, identifying who could vanish without question. His journal entries from this period revealed a methodical escalation, lists of names, coded locations, and notes about restraint designs. Investigators later described reading them as entering a parallel dimension, a structured bureaucracy of cruelty operating unnoticed in a community of retirees and fishermen. Neighbors occasionally heard mechanical sounds late at night, but assumed he was working on engines. When Ray bought building materials, hardware store clerks thought he was doing routine repairs. Even the smell of chemicals from his property, likely cleaning agents, did not alarm anyone. He was a state employee. His presence implied legitimacy. There was, however, a small group of locals who found him unnerving. They recalled how his demeanor changed when women entered a room, how he watched too long, spoke too softly. Some dismissed it as social awkwardness. Others quietly avoided him. But within that tolerance lay his freedom. Elephant Butte's slow pace and transient visitors meant few consistent witnesses. If a woman vanished, she was often assumed to have moved on, not disappeared forever. Cindy Hendy later told investigators that Ray viewed his crimes as projects. He kept schedules, prepared tools days in advance, and recorded details after each act. He described the results in objective scientific language. This precision allowed him to compartmentalize the abuse from his daily life. To finish a shift repairing boat motors, then return home and test new restraints, felt normal to him. His reputation among co-workers stayed intact. They saw a hard-working, mechanically minded man nearing retirement age. Some joked about his secrecy, calling him MacGyver. No one guessed he was the subject of missing person reports scattered across counties. For every new case listing a missing woman, Ray adjusted his routine, driving at night, disposing of evidence far from town, and using drugs to erase memory in survivors. The notion that someone in their midst could be systematically kidnapping and torturing women did not fit the town's self-image. Truth or consequences was small enough that gossip travelled fast, yet no consistent rumour ever formed. Ray's victims were carefully chosen outsiders, women seldom connected to anyone with influence. When one failed to show up again, there were few who went looking. Over the years, his toy box grew more sophisticated. He integrated electrical systems, specialised lighting, and secure restraints built from salvaged machinery. On one wall, he installed a mirror angled toward the central table. The setup suggested both control and surveillance, a captive forced to see what was happening. It was not chaos, but industrial design serving depravity. Ray's ability to blend mundane life with premeditated brutality mystified investigators later. They found the contrast hard to reconcile. His work references praised his professionalism. His property held schematics for torment. A former supervisor described him as methodical and gentle with equipment, recalling, "I never even heard him raise his voice." That calm exterior was camouflage perfected over years. Forensic psychologists reviewing the case later concluded that Ray's success depended on consistency. He avoided drugs beyond those used to subdue victims. He did not seek attention. He maintained structure because chaos threatened his control. In that, he differed from impulsive offenders. He was organized, detached, almost bureaucratic in evil, an administrator of suffering rather than a thrill-seeker. By the mid-1990s, his daughter Jessie drifted away, but remained occasionally in contact. It was through her circle that Ray sometimes found new victims, each lured under pretense of drugs, money, or temporary work. Hendy's involvement deepened. She learned how to distract, how to clean, how to dispose of items afterward. Within this partnership, she became both participant and witness, oscillating between submission to Ray and assertion of her own cruelty. Law enforcement would not connect the pattern for years. Reports of missing women remained siloed across jurisdictions. Data systems were fragmented, and transient lifestyles made tracking nearly impossible. By exploiting that fragmentation, Ray ensured invisibility. Each missing woman existed as an isolated file number, never linked to the quiet man who fixed engines by the lake. It was not luck that protected him. It was structure, routine, perception, and geography. Elephant Butte's slow rhythm drowned quiet screams under the desert wind. Neighbors heard nothing. The park saw nothing. And Ray, meticulous as ever, recorded everything, confident no one would ever listen. When investigators first unsealed the steel doors of David Parker Ray's trailer, they expected to find a typical crime scene, disorder, frantic evidence of violence. Instead, they stepped into something disturbingly organized. The interior gleamed under fluorescent light, cold and metallic, like a surgical room, purpose-built for cruelty. Every surface had been planned. There was no sign of panic or haste. It was above all deliberate. At the center stood a padded table, bolted firmly to the floor. Leather restraints were fastened at wrists, ankles, chest, and neck, each positioned with exact spacing. Overhead hung a motorized hoist attached to adjustable chains. Against one wall rested an array of surgical tools, clamps, scalpels, modified extensions, syringes, and medical forceps. Each tool was labeled and aligned by size. Beside them, drawers contained electrical cords, bottles of lubricant, and cleaning supplies. To anyone else, it might have looked like a clinic, but this was a place designed to erase the boundary between life and suffering. Photographs later released through the investigation showed how thoroughly Ray had turned the trailer into an instrument of control. Hooks on the ceiling, pulleys mounted near mirrors, monitors wired to cameras pointing at the table's center. 2 television screens allowed him to watch captives from different angles, one broadcast into the next room. He could observe every twitch, every attempt at resistance, and replay them for review. He wanted to see his procedures as data, not emotion. The floor space was divided into zones. One corner contained a small cage with steel bars just wide enough for a person to kneel inside. Another held a cabinet stocked with anesthetics, tranquilizers, and a box of disposable syringes labeled "Use Once." Tests later confirmed traces of barbiturates and benzodiazepines, drugs known to cause memory gaps and paralysis. Experts suggested that part of his method was chemical control, ensuring victims woke, disoriented, unable to recall events clearly, and therefore unreliable to investigators if they escaped. Then there were the tapes. Dozens of cassettes, some unlabeled, some marked by date. The first recovered recording began with a static hum, followed by a man's monotone voice. It was Ray. He called it an orientation, a scripted address he played for each captive at the start. In it, he explained that resistance was useless and that obedience would determine survival. He referred to himself by aliases, Master, sometimes simply the man in charge. His tone was neither aggressive nor emotional. It was instructional, like an employee safety video. Forensic psychiatrists, who later analyzed the recordings, found them to be chilling examples of detached cruelty. Ray established compliance through psychological disintegration long before physical abuse began. Every word stripped the victim of identity. Survivors recounted the terror of realizing he had done this many times before, that everything they endured was rehearsed and perfected. Cynthia Vigil's testimony later confirmed that the tapes played continuously during her captivity. She lay chained to the table, forced to hear him describe her future. He told her what she would call him, what she must say if she wanted to eat or breathe without pain. The recording's lack of emotion was the worst part. It treated her existence as a problem to be managed. Investigators also found detailed diagrams tacked to a corkboard. They were hand-drawn, annotated with mechanical notes. Some showed restraint positions labelled with times and pressure points. Others mapped ways to suspend or rotate a human body using pulleys and counterweights. It suggested that Ray spent years perfecting his control systems like a machinist refining prototypes. The diagrams did not emphasize violence for its own sake. They focused on functionality. Pain was secondary to domination. The trailer's soundproofing explained how it remained invisible. Layers of insulation lined the walls, sealed behind aluminum panels. Even inside, with doors closed, the outside world vanished. Technicians demonstrated that shouting at full volume could barely be detected a few feet away. A generator in the adjacent shed powered the lights and hoist without connecting to the house, preventing electrical anomalies from alerting utilities. This level of isolation required planning and money, resources that spoke to the longevity of Ray's secret world. Two investigators described the moment they found a mirror suspended directly above the restraint table, tilted toward the captive's face. It ensured that each person inside would see themselves from above while immobilized. One detective said quietly, he wanted them to watch it happen. Another room held shelves filled with videotapes lacking labels. Most were blank or damaged, but fragments revealed glimpses of movements too dark to identify. To this day, many remain unverified pieces of evidence, classified due to their graphic content. Forensic cleaners catalogued everything: chains tethered to the floor, collars with adjustable screws to restrict breathing, rolls of duct tape, clamps attached to winches, even a machine Ray built that investigators could barely describe publicly. Every component reflected engineering expertise: welding seams polished smooth, bolts reinforced to prevent wear. Some items were repurposed from automotive tools. He converted efficiency into cruelty, turning craftsmanship into a mask for savagery. Search teams also uncovered catalogues from medical supply companies, annotated with orders placed under false names. Receipts stretched back years, evidence of premeditation so methodical it bordered on bureaucratic. Alongside them lay diaries spanning decades, entries detailing his projects, coded with letters and dates. Many corresponded to no known victims. Each line represented a possibility. Another life consumed and forgotten in this metallic room. The psychological environment of the toy box was as integral as its hardware. Ray created an atmosphere of total dependency. Light cycles controlled by him, feeding schedules, unpredictable punishment. Survivors recalled how fear became ritualized. They anticipated pain without knowing when it would come. Experts later termed this conditioned helplessness, a phenomenon where victims cease resisting because their reality has no pattern or escape. Ray appeared to understand it intuitively. He controlled not just bodies but time itself within those walls. When crime scene photographers documented the trailer, one image captured a small handwritten sign on the wall above the table. It read, "If they ain't broke, don't fix them." Investigators interpreted it as grim humor, a reflection of ownership over human life. Others saw it as evidence of his self-perception, the mechanic caring for his machines, indifferent to their humanity. Despite exhaustive analysis, no definitive number of victims could be confirmed from the artifacts alone. Some photographs showed faces later identified as missing women from nearby towns. Others remained unknown. There were also personal objects, jewelry, clothing, identification cards, stacked in boxes that seemed like trophies, yet filed as furniture maintenance parts. Everything blurred into organization. For months after the discovery, officers suffered nightmares. The precision of the space disturbed them more than the gore, because it implied years of undetected operation. One veteran investigator said quietly, "Monsters usually leave messes." He left blueprints. That clinical detachment, more than the violence itself, became the defining feature of his psychological profile. When the evidence finally left the desert that first week, trucks carried hundreds of labeled bags to state facilities. The toy box stood empty, stripped bare, its secrets transferred to folders and storage rooms. But even in photographs, the scale of intentional suffering was overwhelming. This was not spontaneous evil. It was engineered, perfected, mechanized. To the residents of Truth or Consequences, the idea that one of their own built such a chamber was inconceivable. They drove past his property for years without suspecting anything unusual. Now the desert town faced the reality that the toy box had operated among them, soundless and invisible. The horrific precision of that trailer did not just expose one man's crimes, it revealed how easily cruelty can hide behind normalcy when wrapped in order and silence. In the months following the discovery of David Parker Ray's trailer, investigators tried to answer one question that kept surfacing. How many women had disappeared into that space before Cynthia Vigil broke free? The search began with known missing person reports from the early 1990s, but soon sprawled backward in time. The more they looked, the more unsolved cases seemed to echo the same pattern. Vanishing women, mostly young, often living on the margins. Records from Albuquerque, Truth or Consequences, and Socorro showed dozens of disappearances fitting a consistent profile. Many victims were sex workers, transient hitchhikers, or women with histories of drug use. In law enforcement databases of that era, those names rarely stayed active long. Officers assumed they moved on, left town, or chose to disappear. That assumption formed the perfect camouflage for a man like Ray. He did not need to bury the truth. Society ignored it for him. Detectives started compiling data. They mapped names, dates, and locations. Patterns emerged. Women last seen accepting rides near highways. Others who vanished after meeting a man driving a pickup, matching Ray's descriptions. Some left small clues. Abandoned belongings, missing calls to family, or eyewitness accounts mentioning an older man with grey hair and a calm voice. Each fragment pointed toward the Elephant Butte area. One of the earliest possible cases dated back to 1986. A waitress named Marie Parker from Truth or Consequences went missing after leaving a party with two acquaintances, one reportedly a quiet mechanic. Her car was found near the lake. At the time, authorities suspected drugs or voluntary disappearance. After Ray's arrest, Cindy Hendy confessed that Marie had been one of his victims. Evidence from the trailer included a videotape fragment showing a bound woman matching her description. Though partial and degraded, the footage confirmed she never left the desert alive. Another suspected victim was a woman named Kelly Garrett. In 1996, on the night after an argument with her husband, she joined friends at a bar and disappeared. Her last contact was a phone call saying she had met a couple heading to Elephant Butte. Later, after Ray's capture, Hendy identified Garrett by name, recounting details of her abduction and release. She claimed Ray drugged Garrett and, believing she would not remember, dropped her near her home days later. Garrett had awakened confused, her memory fractured, and assumed she had been attacked by strangers. It was not until she saw news coverage years later that she recognized her captor's face. Her testimony became one of the few first-hand windows into Ray's operations prior to Cynthia Vigil's survival. Cases like these illustrated how Ray's system conspired with social invisibility. Law enforcement rarely exchanged information across county lines, and the women most vulnerable to him were those least likely to be missed. Truck stops, bar districts, cheap motels, places of temporary faces. He studied them, selecting victims whose disappearances would generate silence instead of search parties. Investigators estimated potential victims numbering between 40 and 60 based on diaries recovered from his property. Each entry corresponded to coded initials, locations, or dates. Some diary notes described detailed sessions, while others simply listed a date and an object, 3/14 tape. It was unclear whether each represented a real event or fantasy, but the consistency across years suggested lived documentation. Specialists in forensic linguistics examined writing patterns, and concluded that at least portions aligned with known disappearances. Still, without physical remains, most could never be confirmed. To humanize the statistics, detectives revisited families who had lost daughters, sisters, or mothers in the region. Many were shocked to learn that small details in their loved ones' cases matched Ray's methods: belts, cuffs, certain drugs found in toxicology. Some had spent years believing their relatives died from overdose or fled abusive relationships. Confronting the suggestion of deliberate abuse reopened decades-old wounds. One mother from Socorro described receiving phone calls from her daughter's supposed friends after she vanished, claiming she was fine and traveling. Experts later speculated Ray or Hendy might have made such calls to delay suspicion. Small manipulations like that extended his freedom, letting authorities mark missing adults as voluntary. Detectives also uncovered references linking Ray to truck stops along Interstate 25, a corridor connecting major southwestern cities. That route provided both victims and disposal options. Vast stretches of desert where law enforcement coverage was minimal. Cadaver dogs searched multiple sites around Elephant Butte, including old gravel pits and abandoned properties once leased under Ray's name. Soil scans revealed promising anomalies, but no human remains were recovered, conclusively tied to him. The desert preserved silence as efficiently as Ray did. The absence of bodies frustrated investigators and families alike. Without physical evidence, prosecutors relied heavily on testimony and the forensic materials found in the trailer. Yet every missing name added weight to the probability that Cynthia Vigil's escape had interrupted a long-running pattern rather than isolated crimes. Among the testimonies collected after Ray's arrest were several stories from women who had survived unreported abductions. Some came forward only after seeing his photograph on television. One described being drugged at a bar, waking up restrained in a metallic room, and later abandoned miles from town. Another recalled hearing a woman's recorded voice comforting her, possibly Cindy Hendy, before blacking out again. Their fragmented memories aligned with the trailer's layout and the use of certain sedatives. For each surviving account, there were others only implied by evidence: unclaimed jewelry, torn clothing, photographs of unidentified women smiling awkwardly into a camera. Many appeared taken before restraint, suggesting moments of confusion rather than terror, lured into trust seconds before imprisonment. Investigators hoped that releasing still images publicly might spark recognition, but few led to confirmed identities. The community's transient nature meant many of those women had already been written out of state databases before Ray was ever suspected. The lack of closure extended beyond forensics. Psychologists assisting the case warned that the uncertainty itself inflicted secondary trauma on families. Without remains, grief had no endpoint. Authorities kept files open, listing them as potentially linked to DPR, shorthand for David Parker Ray. Over time, those initials became a grim symbol in case archives across New Mexico, a placeholder where resolution should have been. Even years after Ray's death, new information occasionally surfaced. Search operations resumed periodically, guided by Hendy's shifting recollections or new mapping technology. Most ended in frustration. The region's size, hundreds of square miles of rock and brush, made full searches impossible. What lingered instead were human stories half told, glimpsed only through Ray's records and survivors' fragments of memory. The cumulative impact of those disappearances turned the case from isolated atrocity to systemic indictment. It revealed how marginalized women could vanish repeatedly without systems noticing. For investigators, the missing women were more than statistics. They were the measure of how long indifference had enabled one man's precision. While forensic teams continued analyzing evidence, profiles of suspected victims filled office walls, photographs overlapping like a human collage. Each represented stolen years, unanswered calls, empty birthdays. The team understood that most would never see closure. The desert had swallowed too much, but documenting them was a way to reclaim their existence from the void David Parker Ray created behind his unremarkable trailer. In the early hours of March 22nd, 1999, 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil stood handcuffed in a dim motel room in Albuquerque, waiting for what she thought was another routine client. She had worked to survive, and the man who had approached her seemed like any other. He was older, soft-spoken, polite enough to lower her guard. When she turned to remove her shoes, he pressed a badge to her face and said he was police. Then came a flash of metal, handcuffs, a cord around her neck, and chloroform's sickly sweetness. Within seconds, darkness closed in. When she woke, everything had changed. Her wrists ached, her ankles burned, and she was lying inside a small metallic space illuminated by artificial light. A man's voice played from hidden speakers, calm and rehearsed. "Hello there," it began, followed by precise instructions. The tone was not angry. It was bureaucratic. He told her she would remain captive, that cooperation determined comfort, and that resistance meant pain. She realized the voice was not live. It was recorded. The man who entered afterward introduced himself as David. He spoke without expression, explaining rules and consequences while a woman stood nearby watching silently. That woman, Cindy Hendy, assisted as he fixed restraints around Cynthia's neck and ankles. Drugs still clouded her mind, blurring perception, but she sensed discipline in his movements, not frenzy. He worked like a technician performing maintenance, not a man consumed by passion. Over the next 3 days, Cynthia learned her captor's patterns. Ray alternated between direct assault and psychological torment. When she cried, he recorded it. When she begged, he took notes. Hendy at times mocked her, other times acted almost sympathetic, feeding her or cleaning wounds. It was Hendy, not Ray, who occasionally slipped and revealed that Cynthia was not the first. "He's done this before," she whispered once. "Just do not make him mad." The words turned fear into certainty. If she did not escape quickly, she would not leave alive. The trailer's design made fleeing seem impossible. Metal walls sealed every sound. Chains anchored her to an overhead rail that adjusted by switch. Food came irregularly. She memorized small details, the position of hooks, the pattern of Ray's footsteps, the timing of Hendy's visits. Each moment became data in her silent plan. Her chance came late, on the 3rd day. That afternoon, Hendy argued with Ray inside the main house. Through the open door, Cynthia heard raised voices and the clatter of glass breaking. When Hendy returned alone to care for a minor injury, she seemed distracted, leaving the keys on a nearby table before answering a phone. Seconds stretched. Cynthia's heart raced. She forced herself to stay silent, then reached forward, wrists trembling, dragging the chain across the table until the keys fell to the floor. The sound made Hendy turn. In panic, Cynthia swung the heavy lamp toward her, striking her head. Hendy collapsed briefly, cursing. Blood pooled across the floor. In that blur of adrenaline, Cynthia unlocked her wrists, yanked at the collar, and stumbled toward the trailer's exit. Behind her, Hendy screamed for Ray. Cynthia sprinted barefoot into the blinding desert daylight, wearing only a metal dog collar and chain. Outside, the air cut like sandpaper. Each step tore the skin from her feet, but she did not stop. She ran through open brush, following the sound of cars on the highway miles away. The chain clanged against her leg, slowing her down. She spotted distant rooftops and pushed toward them. Behind her, dogs barked. Somewhere on the property, a man shouted her name. Ray's voice, deep and eerily calm, even in pursuit. After nearly a mile, she reached the edge of a trailer park near Elephant Butte. A woman washing her car looked up to see Cynthia collapse beside her, covered in dirt and blood. Startled, the woman dashed inside for her husband. They brought a blanket, locked the door, and called 911. The husband later recalled that she repeated one phrase over and over, "He is going to kill me." Within minutes, police from Truth or Consequences responded. They found Cynthia trembling, her wrists swollen and streaked with rust. She could barely describe what happened, but insisted another woman was involved. Officers removed the chain with bolt cutters and examined deep bruises along her body. Her description of the trailer, interior metal, medical instruments, and a recorded voice, seemed implausible until they realized the address she gave matched that of a local park employee, David Parker Ray. Officers approached Ray's property cautiously, believing they might be confronting a standard abduction. What they found instead exceeded any expectation. A search yielded immediate confirmation of Vigil's story: chains, restraints, blood traces, and medical instruments. The toy box, as Ray had called it, stood only yards behind his house. Meanwhile, medics transported Cynthia to safety. At the hospital, detectives noted her composure amid trauma. She provided a clear timeline, describing Hendy's oversight and Ray's mechanical indifference. When she mentioned the recorded speech, investigators realized they were dealing with a repeat offender who operated like a regimented system. Cindy Hendy attempted to flee that same night, but was captured in the nearby town of Elephant Butte. During interrogation, she initially denied everything, but quickly broke under pressure. Her injuries from the escaped victim betrayed her lie. She admitted that Ray had held multiple women captive, and that he always prepared a tape first. Asked why she assisted, she said quietly, "It was easier to let him do it than to fight him." Her confession guided officers to the full trailer, revealing what would become one of the most disturbing scenes in modern criminal history. For the first responders who had met Cynthia hours earlier, the discovery confirmed the unimaginable. The young woman had survived a place designed so no one ever would. Cynthia's courage transformed the investigation from hidden atrocity to public reckoning. She agreed to describe her experience in detail despite fear of retaliation. Her testimony forced authorities to treat previously dismissed disappearances as potential homicides. FBI agents flew in to coordinate statewide searches, and forensic teams sealed off the property with bright tape and floodlights that glowed through the night. While investigators combed the scene, Cynthia remained under protective supervision. Reporters soon swarmed the hospital, but police shielded her identity until formal charges were filed. When the story broke, national headlines framed her escape as a miracle, one woman's willpower defeating years of secrecy. For the community, it was also a wake-up call. People who had once greeted Ray at grocery stores now realized the quiet man next door had been harboring industrial cruelty. Detectives later said that without Vigil's precision in recounting what she saw, they might never have located the trailer's hidden compartment or recognized the significance of the recorded tapes. Her memory became the blueprint for the search warrant that dismantled Ray's illusion of normalcy. Every victim profile, every diary entry, every piece of evidence that followed stemmed from those moments she chose to run. In psychological evaluations afterward, specialists noted that survivors who escape from prolonged captivity often display remarkable focus. Cynthia fit that pattern. Her instinct to memorize surroundings, recall sound sequences, and exploit distractions aligned perfectly with survival behavior under extreme coercion. She had, unknowingly, performed the kind of situational assessment police are trained for. Years later, in interviews, she said she still heard his recorded voice in dreams. But what mattered most was that she stopped him. Her escape did not just end her own nightmare, it exposed a serial predator who might otherwise have continued indefinitely. In that sense, the moment she grabbed those keys was not only the turning point for one captive, it marked the beginning of truth, overtaking secrecy in the deserts of New Mexico. When police arrived at David Parker Ray's property on that March afternoon in 1999, they expected to find a standard kidnapping scene. What they encountered was a compound designed for concealment. The main house sat modestly among scattered trailers and desert plants. It looked like any other maintenance worker's residence, quiet, sun-bleached, unassuming. But as officers secured the perimeter, what began as a search quickly transformed into an organized operation that drew agencies from across New Mexico. Officers from the Elephant Butte division entered first, accompanied by the Sierra County Sheriff's deputies. Inside the small living room, they found details that immediately supported Cynthia Vigil's claims. Cuffs mounted to the wall, nylon ropes coiled neatly, and syringes positioned on a counter. The air smelled of cleaning chemicals, a scent so strong it burned their eyes. Signs of a struggle were evident in the hallway. A tipped lamp, a trail of blood drops leading to the rear exit. Then came the locked trailer out back, secured with heavy chains and an external padlock unlike anything the officers had seen before. It took nearly 20 minutes to cut the lock. The door opened to the chamber, later known around the world as the toy box. Crime scene specialists, prepared for the worst, were nonetheless stunned into silence. Floodlights illuminated metallic walls, medical tools, restraints, and mechanical equipment whose functions defied immediate understanding. Everything inside seemed deliberate, prearranged, as though its owner expected it to be examined. One detective later described it as a museum of cruelty presented by an engineer. Photographers documented every inch, aware that a single misstep could destroy evidence crucial to identifying victims. They shot hundreds of frames, the restraint table, the shelves, the videotapes labeled by date. Technicians collected fingerprints, hair samples, and traces of blood found near the hoist mechanism. Beneath one cabinet lay a handwritten notebook, its pages filled with coded notations, initials, dates, and cryptic measurements. It read like a catalogue. Some entries corresponded with missing person cases, stretching back more than a decade. Outside, David Parker Ray stood handcuffed beside his daughter Jessie, who had arrived midway through the search. He looked composed, not angry or frightened. When sheriff's deputies read him his rights, he asked calmly, "For what, exactly?" His voice carried none of the anxiety investigators expected. That composure unnerved them even more than the devices inside. He offered short, precise sentences, volunteering nothing but denying little. One officer later recalled, "It was like speaking to a man discussing someone else's property, not his own crimes." Cindy Hendy, already detained from a nearby location, was brought in shortly afterward. Her demeanor contrasted sharply with Ray's. She trembled, eyes swollen, and immediately began talking, first in denial, then shifting to partial confession. She admitted that the trailer had been used for years and that Ray recorded many of his sessions. She described being both accomplice and captive, claiming fear, then complicity. Her words confirmed details they had not yet released publicly, lending credibility to her account. Detectives split teams between examining the property and interviewing witnesses. Neighboring residents, shocked by the sudden influx of police, answered questions through tears and disbelief. Most said Ray was polite, quiet, always fixing something in his yard. None had heard screams or suspicious noises. The soundproofing, investigators realized, had been absolute. Even trained dogs outside the trailer reacted strangely, whining and refusing to approach the main door. Inside the chamber, forensic analysts found objects meticulously stored in labeled drawers, restraints polished to prevent noise, clamps of various sizes, anesthetic vials arranged alphabetically. Chemical analysis later proved that several compounds matched what was found in Cynthia Vigil's blood, barbiturates and benzodiazepines strong enough to induce amnesia. The evidence suggested systematic drugging meant to erase memory, ensuring victims, if released, would be dismissed as unreliable witnesses. Among the most disturbing finds was an audio tape lying beside an outdated recorder. As it played, officers heard Ray's voice deliver the same introduction Cynthia described, word for word. For investigators, the recording ended speculation. It was proof of premeditation, of repeated ritual. They listened only briefly before stopping the playback, the content too graphic to continue. Each repetition of that voice reinforced how mechanical his approach had been. The search widened beyond the trailer. Detectives combed adjacent sheds, vehicles, and the lakefront area where Ray worked. In each location, evidence of his secondary life emerged. Cameras, restraints, and diaries documenting maintenance routines, intertwined with coded sessions. It became clear that his actions were not impulsive. They were scheduled, integrated into daily life. Colleagues at the state park later recalled noticing nothing unusual. He clocked in on time, performed maintenance checks, and chatted casually about weather and engines. That ordinary image fragmented completely under the weight of new evidence. State police requested backup from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Profilers joined the operation to interpret the scene through psychological frameworks. Early assessments described Ray as an organized, non-lethal sadist, meaning his goal was not murder but control, achieved through calculated endurance tests. The notion disturbed investigators who had assumed serial offenders always sought death. In Ray's case, survival of victims functioned as continued dominance, proof of his absolute authority. As teams moved evidence to secure storage, the emotional toll became apparent. Veteran officers stepped outside in silence, cigarette smoke mixing with desert wind. Many later sought counseling. The images they documented could not be forgotten. Even crime scene veterans called it unlike anything they had witnessed, a synthesis of intelligence, patience, and cruelty. Cindy Hendy's cooperation accelerated the investigation. Under continued questioning, she guided officers to buried items around the property. Rings, keys, watches. She said they belonged to women Ray finished with. When asked where the bodies were, she shrugged, unsure. According to her, Ray sometimes released victims, sometimes did not. He liked to watch them try to forget, she said quietly. Her statements, though unreliable in parts, pushed authorities to begin large-scale excavation around Elephant Butte. Cadaver dogs scoured dry gullies and abandoned lots. No confirmed remains were immediately recovered, deepening the sense that much more lay hidden. Meanwhile, Ray maintained his silence. During formal booking, he requested clarification of charges, again appearing calm. Detectives noted his indifference to Hendy's arrest or Cynthia's survival. His answers were clipped and polite. When asked about the trailer, he remarked only, "That is my work area. You will find tools." That phrase echoed chillingly among investigators. It revealed no denial, only classification. Everything, even abuse, was redefined as work. As night fell, floodlights illuminated his fenced property. Evidence techs continued labeling items, medical instruments, electrical distributions, written notes. The list filled dozens of boxes. Items that initially seemed innocuous carried forensic significance: fibers, fingerprints, DNA traces likely belonging to multiple victims. The process lasted days. Each discovery raised new questions about scale. Local media soon surrounded the site, broadcasting live segments from outside police tape. The town of Truth or Consequences, long known for its quiet charm, became synonymous with one of the nation's grisliest criminal scenes. Residents struggled to reconcile the friendly park mechanic with the contents of that trailer. At local diners, conversations dropped to whispers when officers entered. Parents began locking doors earlier, haunted by the knowledge that cruelty had lived unnoticed among them for years. Within 48 hours, formal charges were filed: kidnapping, abuse, and conspiracy. Federal agencies joined to assess possible interstate offenses. Investigators from Arizona and Texas sent representatives, cross-referencing long-missing cases with written diaries. Leads multiplied faster than they could be verified. Forensics laboratories overflowed with evidence shipments, forcing temporary storage expansions. Through it all, Ray remained expressionless. Interrogators attempted psychological pressure, playing audio from his own tapes, confronting him with photographs of recovered tools. He showed mild irritation, no guilt. A forensic psychiatrist later commented that Ray exhibited affective flattening, a rare absence of emotional response, often seen in psychopathy. His measured demeanor, even under accusation, underscored his need for control. He believed the narrative belonged to him alone. By the end of that week, authorities closed off the property entirely, sealing the trailer as prime evidence. Inside, they left markers denoting each object's placement for future reconstruction. Investigators would later recreate the entire interior for court presentation, allowing juries to step, virtually, into the space where so many disappeared. The arrest of David Parker Ray represented both triumph and unease. Justice had begun, but understanding had barely started. The more forensic analysts uncovered, the clearer it became that the toy box was not just a crime scene, it was a blueprint of obsession, the physical map of one man's effort to engineer submission. For the detectives who had pried open that chained door, the memory of what waited inside would outlast headlines and trials. When psychiatrists and profilers began studying David Parker Ray after his arrest, they knew they were confronting an offender whose actions challenged the usual framework of serial violence. He was not motivated by chaos or rage. He was organized, measured, and disturbingly consistent. Where most offenders reacted out of impulse or emotion, Ray operated like a scientist conducting controlled experiments, each victim treated as another step toward perfecting domination. Experts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit described Ray as an organized sadist, a classification reserved for offenders who derive satisfaction primarily through control rather than destruction. What made him different was scale and precision. From the construction of his trailer to the language in his diaries, everything pointed to one psychological constant: mastery. He sought total authority, not just over physical movement, but over perception itself. In his world, even a victim's memories were subject to design. Clinical assessments revealed several overlapping personality traits: narcissism, antisocial behavior, and paraphilic sadism. The narcissism explained his arrogance in assuming he could outsmart investigators. The antisocial elements showed in his disregard for empathy, remorse, or social boundaries. But his defining feature was sadism expressed through meticulous structure. He did not abuse to release tension, he orchestrated it like an art form governed by rules he wrote himself. Forensic psychologists compared his behavior to that of other organized offenders, the calculated routines of Ted Bundy, the ritualism of BTK. Yet Ray lacked their overt charm or need for recognition. He stayed hidden, preferring the perfection of procedure to the thrill of bragging. He once told an acquaintance, "People destroy their fun by talking about it." That secrecy was not shame, it was control. Speaking aloud would hand power to others. His silence ensured ownership of his narrative until the end. Investigators noticed that Ray's trailer resembled less a dungeon and more a workshop of theories made tangible. Each modification demonstrated adaptive learning. When a method failed to produce the desired behavior, he redesigned. Psychologist Dr. Kristen Hayden, who reviewed his files, remarked that he turned psychology into engineering. He wanted predictable results, not surprises. Notes within his journals supported that view. He categorized victims by resistance levels, physical endurance, and verbal reactions. He was not documenting pain but compliance thresholds. During interrogation, Ray remained composed, answering direct questions with clinical detachment. When asked why he recorded the orientation tapes in advance, he replied, "Efficiency saves repetition." No emotional inflection, no attempt to justify. That sentence alone summarized his psyche. Efficiency as virtue, people as processes. In his mind, crime became maintenance, each interaction part of a system requiring calibration. One recurring element in his writings involved performance. He saw himself as both craftsman and teacher, coaching his accomplices through sessions. Cindy Hendy later recalled him explaining psychological principles behind obedience. He referenced conditioning techniques, alternating between intimidation and reward to shape behavior. Experts recognized elements of military training and behaviorist psychology, systems he likely absorbed during his army service. He manipulated fear through predictability, understanding that consistent reactions breed submission faster than random violence. What struck analysts most was his emotional flatness. He spoke of captivity the way a mechanic discusses gear ratios. Even when confronted with testimony describing unimaginable suffering, he offered mild corrections about logistical details. That gap between cognitive understanding and emotional absence defined him. Dr. Janice Moore, a forensic psychiatrist involved in the case, described him as a man who replaced empathy with curiosity. He did not hate his victims, he studied them. In the hierarchy of his world, understanding suffering took precedence over feeling it. Inside Ray's head, control equaled order, disorder represented weakness. His life outside crime mirrored that principle: neatly arranged tools, consistent schedules, minimal social contact. Investigators discovered that his diaries aligned precisely with his work shifts. He planned abductions around maintenance logs, ensuring plausible alibis. This integration of abuse into routine reflected what psychologists term compartmentalization, the ability to isolate incompatible behaviors without cognitive dissonance. Ray could service a park generator in the morning, abuse a captive by evening, and sleep soundly, all compartments sealed from one another. Yet, his precision did not erase insecurity. Colleagues and ex-partners described him as sensitive to criticism, withdrawn when questioned, and prone to sudden silence if contradicted. That fragile ego often drives sadistic control fantasies. The abuser restores self-worth by reducing others to helplessness. Ray's upbringing, dominated by an authoritarian father who equated obedience with respect, likely cemented this pattern. For him, dominance was not only physical, it was self-definition. His fascination with recording devices also revealed psychological depth. By taping victims and replaying scenes, he re-experienced control without risk. Playback allowed the illusion of permanence, each act immortalized, each captive still under his command even after release or death. Experts compared this to compulsive archivism found in other narcissistic offenders. They collect proof, not for nostalgia but validation. The existence of the recording confirmed superiority. I made it happen, and it exists because of me. When analyzing Ray's conversations with Hendy, psychologists observed how he framed their crimes as shared discovery rather than coercion. He often used plural pronouns, we, ours, to diffuse moral burden and sustain unity. Hendy later admitted she adopted his language unconsciously, calling victims projects. This linguistic control exemplified coercive persuasion, the subtle rewriting of meaning, until accomplices perceive abuse as partnership. Ray did not just enslave physically, he colonized language itself. Comparisons to other predatory personalities highlight an essential difference. Ray's actions reveal minimal impulsivity. Many offenders escalate as tension builds, culminating in uncontrolled violence. Ray's satisfaction came from perpetuity, the continuation of order. Killing ended control. Therefore, he avoided it when possible. Survivors noted that he threatened execution constantly but rarely followed through unless discipline failed. Psychologists interpreted this restraint as ultimate expression of dominance, sparing life not from mercy, but to prolong ownership. In interviews, Ray dismissed moral frameworks entirely. When asked if he considered his actions wrong, he deflected, "Everyone has hobbies. Mine just are not accepted." To him, societal rules were arbitrary agreements among weaker minds. This total moral disengagement placed him within a narrow band of psychopathy distinguished by intellectualization. He rationalized atrocity as experimentation, insulating himself from guilt through semantics. At trial, observers saw glimpses of that same self-assurance. He sat upright, hands folded, occasionally taking notes. When witnesses recounted moments of horror, he sometimes nodded slightly, as though assessing accuracy. Psychiatrists later reviewed footage of those sessions, describing micro-expressions consistent with satisfaction rather than remorse. For Ray, the courtroom was simply another controlled environment, one he no longer commanded, yet still evaluated for procedural efficiency. Behind that composure, however, was fragility masked by discipline. Pathological control often originates in terror of vulnerability. Ray's early experiences with humiliation, isolation, and paternal dominance bred a lifelong fear of powerlessness. By scripting every detail of captivity, from recorded introductions to release protocols, he erased unpredictability, the force that once governed his childhood. In mastering others, He believed he had mastered fate. Experts agreed that Ray represented a rare psychological hybrid, sadistic curiosity merged with mechanical intellect. Most offenders either intellectualize their impulses or succumb to them emotionally. Ray synthesized both. His intellect provided structure, his paraphilia provided purpose. The result was cruelty disguised as craftsmanship. One profiler summarized it. He did not see victims as people or even toys. He saw them as mechanisms proving his control worked. When asked during evaluation about religion or morality, Ray shrugged. He claimed belief in natural order, a phrase recurring in his writings. To him, life divided between those who control and those controlled. He saw himself in the first category by design, not luck. That worldview eliminated empathy entirely. Suffering was not evil, merely function. In the sterile logic of his mind, the toy box was not hell, but laboratory. Even his eventual arrest fit the narrative he had built internally. Psychologists studying transcripts noted how often he used passive voice. Mistakes were made. Not I made mistakes. Deflection reinforced his sense of being observer rather than actor. He diagnosed himself during one exchange, saying, "I over-engineered it. Too organized draws attention." That self-critique signaled pride more than regret. Months after his death in custody, clinicians continued analyzing his case for insights into the complexities of organized sadism. They concluded that Ray's intelligence shielded his pathology, allowing him to simulate normalcy through competence. He did not feign kindness but reliability, the quieter disguise that seldom raises alarms. This strategic neutrality may have been his most dangerous trait. Looking at photographs of his workspace, experts saw more than instruments. They saw personality externalized, clean lines, symmetry, precision. Every bolt tightened, every tool returned to place. The trailer functioned as architectural autobiography. It told the story of a man who replaced emotional chaos with measurable order, who sought godlike authority through mechanics. Ultimately, David Parker Ray's mind revealed not spontaneous evil but deliberate construction, a psyche that built horror, one adjustment at a time. When the trial of David Parker Ray began, years of silent horror finally entered a public room. The courthouse in Truth or Consequences was small, its wooden benches built for traffic cases, not a proceeding that would draw national media. Yet from the first day, every seat was filled. Reporters, relatives of missing women, and residents who once called Ray a neighbor sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear what really happened inside the trailer known as the toy box. The legal process was complicated from the start. Despite hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, few living victims could testify. Many probable victims were gone, and those who survived often battled memory loss caused by the drugs Ray used. Prosecutors faced a system meant to reward clear testimony and concrete proof. What they had instead were fragments, records, coded diaries, and a handful of traumatized voices. Still, they built their strategy around Cynthia Vigil's escape, and the corroboration provided by Ray's partner, Cindy Hendy. Cynthia Vigil was the prosecution's anchor. On the stand, she spoke calmly, describing how she had been abducted, chained, and forced to hear Ray's recorded instructions. The jury listened to portions of that cassette. The air in the courtroom turned silent, except for the monotonous voice from the speakers. Some jurors cried. Others stared at the table, unable to meet the sound with their eyes. Cynthia explained how she memorized details of the trailer, the lights, the tools, Hendy's momentary mistakes. Her recollection formed a map investigators had already confirmed. It was, as one prosecutor said, truth built from endurance. Then came Cindy Hendy's testimony. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, she spoke as a cooperating witness, hoping for leniency. Her voice shook at first, but gained steadiness as she recounted years of involvement. She told jurors that Ray had shown her the trailer early in their relationship and called it a place for exploration. Gradually she became participant, not by belief in his philosophy, but through slow corrosion of resistance. Under questioning, she admitted bringing victims to the property and helping subdue them. When asked why she stayed, Hendy said, "He made me feel like it was normal, like I was helping him study something." Her testimony was graphic, matching the evidence recovered from the scene. She identified items in photographs, explaining how Ray organized sessions like experiments with specific goals. Hendy's fear was palpable, but defense attorneys seized on her criminal record, arguing she had shaped her story to curry favor. They emphasized her drug history and prior convictions, casting her as unreliable. The defense strategy hinged on reframing everything found in the trailer as consensual equipment used privately between adults. They claimed the women were voluntary participants too ashamed to admit it afterward. For weeks, That argument battled against overwhelming unease. The prosecution countered with forensic data, traces of blood belonging to multiple individuals, chemical residues matching sedatives, and the recorded speech void of consent or mutual participation. They played brief segments of the orientation tape again, pointing out Ray's tone, detached authority, incompatible with any plausible role-play. Expert witnesses in psychology testified that his meticulous language and the presence of drugs proved coercion, not fantasy. Ray himself sat silently through most of it, wearing glasses, jaw tightened. Observers remarked that he rarely looked toward the witness stand. During cross-examinations, he scribbled notes and occasionally whispered to his attorney. His expression never changed, even when graphic details surfaced. One journalist later wrote, "If guilt had a face, it looked disappointingly calm. That calm unnerved victims' families far more than any outburst could have." As the trial unfolded, prosecutors introduced evidence from earlier suspected crimes. Kelly Garrett, one of the few women to survive before Cynthia Vigil, testified by video. She described being drugged, waking bound in a metallic room, then losing memory for days. Her husband initially had not believed her. Seeing Ray's photograph years later had revived buried terror. Her fragmented story echoed the pattern so neatly that even the defense struggled to dismiss it as coincidence. Jessie Ray, David's daughter, appeared briefly under subpoena. Her statements were limited. She acknowledged seeing some of her father's behavior, but claimed ignorance of criminal acts. Observers sensed conflict, the loyalty of family colliding with the gravity of evidence. Her testimony added complexity, but little clarity. After months of proceedings, prosecutors struck plea agreements, rather than risking mistrial due to fading memories. Ray faced multiple charges across counties. To prevent constant retrials, both sides negotiated. Eventually, he accepted a deal acknowledging kidnapping and abuse, avoiding the death penalty but ensuring life imprisonment. Victims' advocates criticized the bargain, arguing it denied full justice to the disappeared. Yet, practical limits left few alternatives. Without bodies or coherent recollections, convictions on murder charges remained uncertain. Throughout sentencing, Ray maintained composure. When offered a chance to speak, he declined, telling the judge, "I have nothing to add." Those 5 words echoed the emptiness at his core. The courtroom, expecting outrage or apology, met only silence. The judge called his acts crimes beyond reason, crimes beyond words, then imposed a sentence exceeding 220 years. In the back row, Cynthia Vigil wept quietly, supported by relatives. Hendy, already sentenced separately to decades in prison, did not attend. During appeals hearings that followed, Ray's attorneys attempted to challenge evidence chain and witness credibility. None succeeded. Each appeal reaffirmed that the trailer, tapes, and testimonies painted an irrefutable picture of sustained abuse. Psychological evaluations submitted to the court confirmed he met diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, defined by lack of empathy and manipulative intelligence. The clinical tone of the reports mirrored the tone of his own notes, precise, emotionless, focused on systems rather than suffering. The community surrounding Elephant Butte never recovered its sense of normalcy. Reporters lingered for years, and tourism dropped. Locals who once trusted their quiet neighbor felt a mix of guilt and disbelief. The courtroom, though just a small building, became the symbolic site where the facade of small-town safety shattered. When the final verdicts were read, survivors described an unusual relief, not of joy, but of confirmation. Their stories were real. The chamber had existed. The voice on the tape belonged to a man who would never leave prison. Yet justice carried an undertone of incompleteness. Many victims remained unidentified. Their families would never see closure. Ray's diaries hinted at numbers far beyond those proven. Even as he awaited transfer to state prison, he never revealed the full list. 3 years later, in 2002, before further sentencing in additional jurisdictions, Ray collapsed from a heart attack after a pre-trial conference. He died instantly. No confession followed, no final statement to explain what investigators had sought for years. Some saw his quiet death as evasion, others accepted it as anticlimax, fitting his nature, control to the end, even over the story's closure. After his death, prosecutors archived evidence too extensive for a single facility. The trailer was dismantled and stored in sections for research and law enforcement training. The courtroom transcripts entered academic study, referenced in seminars on forensic psychology and investigative failures. For Cynthia Vigil and other survivors, each document stood as testament that their voices had broken through years of disbelief. The The case files labeled DPR remain active for review whenever new missing person data appears. In the legal sense, justice concluded with a life sentence that outlived the man. In the social sense, it marked accountability for institutions that once ignored those most at risk. The courtroom had not only judged a criminal, it had indicted complacency. From that final day forward, the name David Parker Ray ceased being rumor and became record, proof that order can disguise evil until someone dares to speak. When David Parker Ray died in 2002, the morning news carried the headline quietly, "Toy box killer dead of heart attack." There were no dramatic last words, no confession left behind. He simply collapsed in a courthouse holding cell while waiting for yet another round of pre-trial proceedings. For victims, detectives, and families still hoping he might reveal burial sites or names, the news landed like a door slamming shut. Decades of unanswered questions died with him. In Sierra County, investigators gathered in the evidence room surrounded by boxes labeled DPR. Some had spent years trying to coax details from him. Others had dug through the desert searching for remains. Now, their quarry was gone. Lead Detective Pat Apodaca said later, "We did not want revenge. We wanted answers." His death robbed everyone of that. The files remained open, but closure drifted further away. News of Ray's death reached survivors differently. Cynthia Vigil, living under a new identity, told reporters she felt both relief and anger. The man who had hunted women like specimens would never face the full consequence of what he had done. Yet she also admitted she no longer woke in fear of his release. Other families sent letters to the district attorney's office, some thanking the team, others demanding renewed searches at Elephant Butte Lake. For months after his death, law enforcement teams returned to those quiet shores. Cadaver dogs followed grids marked on satellite maps, each square representing coordinates Hendy once mentioned. Excavators turned layers of compacted soil, their movements mirrored by reporters lining the edges of the dig sites. Nothing surfaced. The desert gave nothing back. With every unproductive search, skepticism grew. Had Ray buried his victims at all, or had he disposed of them in ways even more efficient? Cindy Hendy, serving her sentence at a New Mexico correctional facility, granted interviews during that time. Her story shifted over the years. Sometimes she insisted Ray had killed multiple women. Other times she claimed most were released. She spoke of distant burial points she could not precisely recall. Investigators followed each new claim, only to find barren sand and sun-bleached stones. Still, her cooperation remained their only remaining compass. She seemed haunted less by guilt than by confusion, unsure whether she had been participant, witness, or survivor herself. Meanwhile, the town of Truth or Consequences struggled to shed the stigma attached to his name. Stores near the lake displayed newspaper clippings as memorials to resilience, yet tourism dipped sharply. The casual beauty of Elephant Butte's waters took on an uneasy significance. People could not help wondering what lay beneath. State officials eventually ordered Ray's property demolished. The trailer that had housed his crimes was dismantled piece by piece, transported to a law enforcement training compound for study. Its absence left an empty lot, surrounded by chain link. Locals drove past quickly, unwilling to slow down. Psychologists continued analyzing the case long after his death. They used it as curriculum in criminal profiling courses, focusing not on gore but on the mechanisms of concealment. Ray's ability to operate undetected for decades became a cautionary example of systemic blindness. His victims were primarily marginalized women, addicts, runaways. Each label worked as camouflage, allowing police reports to fade as paperwork rather than prompts for investigation. In seminars, experts argued that Ray's longevity was not just his doing, it was society's. For survivors, rebuilding meant decades of therapy and public scrutiny. Some received compensation through victim support funds, others preferred anonymity. In rare interviews, they spoke less about the events themselves and more about what it felt like to be believed after years of dismissal. Cynthia Vigil's later advocacy for missing persons highlighted that shift. She told a journalist, "They did not listen until I ran out screaming. How many others could not?" Her question became an indictment of apathy that echoed far beyond New Mexico. Investigators also revisited procedural lapses, the fragmented databases, the lack of coordination between counties, and the cultural bias that had devalued victims living on society's edge. The State Attorney General's post-mortem review concluded that had early disappearances been investigated comprehensively, Ray might have been stopped a decade earlier. But those hypotheticals arrived too late. The only certainty left was loss measured in years erased from ordinary lives. Academics and documentarians later transformed the case into study material on deviance and institutional oversight. University lectures dissected his psychological architecture, while advocacy groups used it to press for reform in how missing person files were prioritized. Broadly, Ray's name became shorthand for how evil can function under regulation and routine. Instead of inspiring fear of monsters, his story revealed how bureaucracy itself can serve as camouflage. Even now, long after every trial concluded, sporadic searches resume whenever new technology offers promise. In 2011, ground-penetrating radar teams scanned previously inaccessible ravines near Elephant Butte. The results suggested soil disturbances but no clear human remains. Each new exploration reignites local anxiety, a reminder that the desert still holds unsolved stories. Law enforcement continues to log anonymous tips, most unverifiable, some heartbreakingly specific. One caller reported a night sighting of a pickup matching Ray's decades-old vehicle near a rest area long after his death, proving myths never rest easily. Within criminology circles, one debate endures. Was David Parker Ray primarily a killer or an obsessive collector of submission? The absence of confirmed murders complicates classification. Psychologists argue that defining him only by life or death obscures the broader horror, his deliberate transformation of people into mechanisms for power. Whether victims survived or not, the intent remained annihilation of identity, a violence deeper than murder. In the years following his death, the state marked minor victories. New legislation improved coordination for missing adult investigations. Databases linking transient populations now flag patterns earlier. Each reform bore traces of lessons learned from the toy box killer case, yet no policy could compensate for the lives uncounted. In memorial exhibits curated by advocacy groups, victims' faces share space with notebook copies and photographs of desert search teams, a juxtaposition of humanity and evidence. For locals, time softened but never erased the wound. The name once whispered now serves as a warning that depravity rarely arrives as a stranger. It can live quietly beside you, fixing engines, waving from a driveway. The desert winds still move through Elephant Butte at dusk, carrying fragments of that story, proof that some horrors end in court, while others persist in memory. The aftermath of David Parker Ray is not merely a closed file. It is a continuing reminder of how silence and neglect allow the unimaginable to exist undisturbed. In the years since David Parker Ray's trailer was sealed and dismantled, his case has remained less a chapter of crime history than a mirror reflecting what happens when cruelty hides behind routine. It forced communities, investigators, and psychologists to ask not just how such brutality existed, but how it persisted unnoticed for decades. Beneath every forensic report lay a more unsettling truth. The machinery of his crimes wasn't confined to the trailer. It was embedded in the systems that ignored his victims. The survivors became voices of accountability. Cynthia Vigil transformed her ordeal into advocacy, speaking out for women whose lives were dismissed because of addiction, sex work, or marginalization. Through interviews and talks, she emphasized that recognition is the first form of protection. They have to matter before they're missed, she said. Her resilience reframed the narrative from mere survival to reclamation of worth. Law enforcement agencies across New Mexico implemented training to spot patterns of coercion and prioritize missing adult reports. The case highlighted that bureaucracy could either safeguard or erase people. Officers who once dismissed disappearances as voluntary began approaching them through trauma-informed frameworks. In this quiet shift, the legacy of the toy box killer turned from fear into reform, from nightmares into vigilance. Psychologists studying Ray's methods drew lessons that extended beyond criminal behavior. His meticulous detachment resembled organizational pathology, how rigid structure can normalize harm when empathy is absent. In lectures, they used his trailer as metaphor, a sealed, ordered environment designed to eliminate conscience. Such reasoning, they warned, can infect institutions that prioritize efficiency over humanity. Ray's cruelty was extreme, but its foundation, dehumanization through process, exists in subtler forms everywhere. For families of missing women, remembrance became resistance. Community organizations hold annual vigils near Elephant Butte, reading names even when identities remain unconfirmed. Most belong to women's society, undervalued in life and nearly erased in death. Under the desert sky, candles shine as acts of visibility, reclaiming what silence sought to erase. Each year, new attendees arrive not to sensationalize, but to insist that empathy can prevent tragedy. Cindy Hendy remains an ambiguous figure in this legacy. Her cooperation helped convict Ray, Yet her participation raises enduring questions about complicity under coercion. Criminologists cite her as a study in moral drift, the slow erosion of resistance through exposure. Her story illustrates a hard truth. Evil rarely recruits ideology. It cultivates obedience until participation feels inevitable. Over time, Ray's former property shifted from landmark of terror to research subject. Portions of the trailer were preserved in secure facilities for forensic training. Investigators use it to teach recruits how obsession with order can conceal depravity, demonstrating that the cleanest crime scenes are often the most meticulously planned. In broader culture, the toy box killer became shorthand for hidden monstrosity. But reducing his story to legend risks blunting its lesson. The true horror was logistical, a man using patience, planning, and procedural mastery to turn control itself into cruelty. Understanding that pattern helps society recognize danger earlier, in workplaces, relationships, or institutions where unchecked authority thrives. For the survivors, life became reconstruction rather than recovery. Therapy, advocacy, and anonymity coexist as coping mechanisms. Years later, Cynthia Vigil reflected, "I'm not what he did, I'm what lived after." Her words have closed countless interviews, defining the human victory his system could never calculate. The lessons of this case remain uncomfortable but essential. Monsters aren't supernatural, they are methodical. They thrive in disbelief, in the spaces where victims are ignored and rules go unexamined. Elephant Butte's quiet shoreline bears no visible scar today, yet its emptiness reminds visitors of the vigilance ordinary life demands. The story of the toy box killer ends not with his death, but with an enduring question. How many warnings must society ignore before it acts? Because the next hidden chamber may not exist in a trailer, it may lie wherever indifference meets opportunity, waiting only for someone to notice the lock that should never have been there.